All right, so for the 23 people that subscribe to Epix, there is a show that just concluded its premiere season that has a pretty intriguing concept. From is mysterious, creepy, and very ambitious, but is it worth getting a subscription to Epix to watch? Travelers find themselves stranded in a town where the residents struggle for a sense of normalcy in a very abnormal situation. The arrival of some new people reignites the search for a way out, but every day at sundown, a terror emerges from the forest, threatening their very existence. This stars Harold Perrineau, and some of the marketing material made mention that it was also from a producer of Lost. Now, not the producers of Lost, just a producer. But this is also produced by the Russo brothers, so there is money and creativity working in the background. Like I had said in the synopsis, the whole premise of this show is that there are all of these people who are stranded or even trapped in this mysterious town. Some of them have been there for a very long time, but when a new group of people becomes trapped there, their antsiness to get out becomes sort of contagious, and others that had just kind of resigned themselves to life in this place are now rethinking that strategy. I love the premise of this, especially because there's this violent threat that comes from the surrounding forest when the sun goes down. Now, the show, while it doesn't necessarily show the actual violence that can occur, it doesn't stray away from showing us the gory aftermath, so we do get a very good sense of why the townspeople are so fearful. For me, this felt very similar to Stephen King's Under the Dome, because you've got an isolated town where people can't escape. Now, that one actually showed the reason why, but in From, it's much more mysterious. And the threats in this one tend to come more from the outside rather than from the inside. The show started out very intriguing and engaging. There was this high sense of urgency and tension that hooked us almost immediately and made us want to see and learn more. But somewhere along the way, the show kind of loses the plot. I mean, it doesn't lose it completely, but the story begins to branch off into multiple avenues, and it really worries me that there's no game plan for how this will all play out in the long run. For the lack of a better term, we have the monster story, which is the terror that comes from the forest. Now, there are elements within this storyline that lead me down a path of what they are, with a very few key pieces that make sense for my hypothesis. Now, I'm being very vague to avoid spoilers, but at the end of this video, I'm going to give a good warning, and then I'll give some of my suspicions that include a ton of spoilers. The show also introduces an element that messes with time and space. Now again, this is a cool concept, and it does provide some interesting plot conveniences, but there's a lot of vagueness still surrounding this. And as I go through these, it may sound like I'm expecting to have all of the answers sorted out in this first season. Now, I'm not. I love when mystery continues, but when the season concludes, no answers have been given, but even more questions have been begun. And while that's not a bad thing in itself, it does cause me some concern because I've seen more than my fair share of shows that really start off with its great and compelling concept, only to have them fall apart because they either get too convoluted for their own good, and then they never end up answering anything before the show is eventually canceled, which then leaves us as viewers stranded and annoyed. Now, the monsters are a pretty large story influence, and they're also character motivators for portions of the show. But there also comes points where they seem completely forgotten, and it feels like there's not an impending threat that's just outside the door as soon as the sun goes down. That continual pressure can be wonderful for what it does to a character's psyche and their behavior, but it seems to fall by the wayside as the show goes along. The story also introduces visions into the narrative. Are these ghosts, or maybe they're hallucinations? I mean, I'm not sure. And again, these can be great additions to the plot, but right now, they're one more element that is being added to the tale without any seeming progress. And then there's a complication within the story that involves electricity. It's very curious, and something that adds a whole nother layer of mystery to how things work within this town. The story also introduces an unseen creature of sorts, even though we can certainly guess what it is. Now, it made my skin crawl, even though I never actually saw it. So where are we at now? There are monsters, there's time and space, visions, an unseen creature, and the electricity. I mean, that's 5 different things, and there are still nuances of each of these that I'm just not getting into. And finally, there's a story element that's a voice. Now, it's audible, so it's not a singular hallucination. And I think by itself, it's a cool element to introduce because of how it comes about, and then what it says becomes very unsettling. This first season is a 10-episode run, and I was engaged the whole time. The way the shots are framed create this huge sense of unease. And I like that there are times where it feels like something bad is about to happen, so I become all uncomfortable. And the scene changes then, only to have something freaky happen later on when my guard goes back down. The way the show plays with our emotions, I think it's enjoyable. I mean, I'm totally invested in the ride of the mystery. But here's the thing, when the finale comes, I have so many more questions than when I started out with. By the end, the monsters that come from the forest seem like they're not important. More and more elements are being introduced, which make me feel like the writers don't totally know where they're headed. So they're just going to keep introducing new complications that will hopefully distract us from their lack of direction. Now, I enjoyed the acting. We get the wide range of characters that you'd expect when you thrust a whole bunch of people into a location and then don't let them leave. Now, I love the dynamics that come about, especially with how no nonsense some of them are, which then makes for some very humorous interactions. And I think it's a wise choice to limit the number of characters that we interact with, because if the show kept introducing more and more players who gain focus, I mean, even if it's just for a while, it gets even more convoluted and busy. I do think there are opportunities here and there, though, to let some background people pop in and out, but for the most part, maintaining that core that are essential to the story, which then helps to keep it more concise. So overall, I'm torn with this series. I love the imagery, the premise, and even the tone of the story. We're taking people and confining them to a location and then presenting this ominous and violent threat. The acting is good, even when there are slight moments of melodrama, too. And the characters begin to get decent backstory and development on them as the series goes along. There is also just a great deal of tension and dread that surrounds the entire narrative. The drawback, though, is that the series manages not to answer any of the questions that it raises. And through the course of the story, it actually creates more questions than it started with. Now, I don't need all the answers, but even having one would have given me a bit of reassurance that the writers have a direction in mind and that they know where they're taking us as the audience. The story also sort of loses the plot and forgets about the monsters that lurk in the forest for large chunks of story time. The whole narrative feels like the writers keep pouring more into the story in an effort to distract from the fact that they don't have a roadmap and are kind of winging it as it goes along. I'm really hoping that a second season is coming, and then it wraps up certain portions while intriguing us with others. It's hard, though, to overly recommend this as it stands. There's no sex or nudity, a ton of profanity, and a lot of violence, along with some very gruesome imagery. I give season 1 of From 2.5 out of 5 couches. Now, if the second season comes and gives me confidence that the show has a known story arc, my score could go way up for this. Alright, so if you don't want any spoilers, now's your chance to bail. Thanks so much for watching and for couching with me. Now let's dive into some spoilers for this, and I'm going to give you some of my best guesses at what some of this means. Now admittedly, I don't know many of the answers. These are just my theories. So let's start with the monsters. My best guess is that they're vampires. They only come out at night, they devour people with their wickedly sharp teeth and long nails, and they are held at bay by a talisman. I mean, kind of similar to movie vampires that are affected by crosses. Plus, they can't enter a building unless they're invited in, and they are very seductive, playing on the strong needs and feelings of their prey. Now, they do have reflections, as we saw when Colony House was attacked, but the show could be defining its own set of vampire rules, which in that case I'm totally good with as long as they explain them. And this being from a producer of Lost, the first thought that came to my mind is that the characters are dead and in some sort of purgatory. Thankfully, though, the show addresses that in one of the episodes. Tabitha asks the priest if he thinks they're dead, and the response is a great one for the characters. I mean, even if they are, they're still experiencing all the things around them. So what does it matter? Now, for the characters, that makes total sense. But for us as the audience, if they are dead, then everything they experience is inconsequential. If they're already dead and in some sort of hell or purgatory, I mean, who cares? It has zero bearing on anything and then becomes a frustrating endeavor for us to endure. So I'm choosing to believe that they're not dead, but somehow just trapped in this odd location. Now, I'm very baffled at how they all ended up here, since it's told to us that they all originated from different areas and different roads. So is this a wormhole type of thing, or just some sort of interdimensional passageway? And why did it seem like the RV was going to escape the road when it had turned around and encountered Jade's vehicle coming in the opposite direction? Now, I love the complication this creates within the story, and I think it really helps to build out the mystery. And that can also play into the whole teleporting tree thing that some of the characters use to escape the forest. Now, I really am still uncertain of the rules for that whole tree thing, though. I mean, the same tree seems to send people to random locations. So when both Victor and Julie use the tree to escape, they end up in different spots. And there are more than one of those trees, as we see in the finale, because Boyd goes into a tree and then ends up trapped in some chimney-looking thing. Now, I love the idea of this, but again, I want to know the rules about how they function within the story, and hopefully we're going to get a bit of insight into them in the next season. I think the voices and the visions that Sarah receives are very intriguing. I mean, is she psychic? It would seem so since she was able to hear Boyd's wife, but also she gets those creepy messages from somewhere telling her to kill certain people. And I want to know if that same voice that speaks to her is the one that spoke to Jim over the radio in the finale. Could the voices be the vampires just using telepathy? I mean, that is, I know, a huge, massive assumption on my part because we've not been shown anything to support that at all. And then there's the boy in white who seems to be a helper or guide, but he's not always present. And I'm not convinced that he's a benevolent creature either. My guard is raised on everybody, so I'm going to have to see more of him to determine if he's impish or admirable. And why does Jade continue to have visions too? What he sees, I think, is really disturbing. I mean, well, we don't see the visions that Sarah has. We watch Jade being chased by some sort of zombified Civil War soldier. And he also saw that dude who was smashed by a boulder in the bunker. And now what's up with the spiders in the finale? I mean, something dragged that tent that Boyd and Sarah were in. And upon seeing all those nasty spider webs in the forest, I only see images of Aragog and Shelob, which are just freaky and nasty and a whole lot of nope. But then we see all those creepy baby spiders pour out of the nest and onto Boyd. I mean, that's probably the freakiest moment of the entire series for me. But I still don't know what they all mean. And then why is there a lighthouse at the edge of the forest? I mean, it's like a beacon, but it's also a warning. Like it's drawing them towards the light, but also warning them of the dangers around. I mean, I'm just so curious at how it's going to come into play in the second season. Are you as intrigued by the layer that's uncovered underneath the Matthews home as I am? I mean, after Tabitha digs and digs down and then the whole ground cracks, that underground cavern filled with drawings and symbols, I thought was just awesome to look at. I wanted more time to be spent there so that we could examine more of what we see. But having to rush really does maintain just a good sense of urgency. And plus, Victor says that it's kind of the monster's lair and that they are down there, which again raises more questions about what the heck is going on. All right, so that's basically all that I have on this. I mean, I'd love to hear your theories on the show and all the elements within the story. I mean, I am sure that I'm missing out on some of the bigger details, so please chime in and share. And were you as torn on the show as I was, or did you really love it, or did you really hate it? I mean, I loved what it was setting up, but I also have very little faith that a roadmap is secured for the story. And so if this can shore up some of the arcs in the second season, this has the potential to be a great show. If you enjoyed this, please give it a like. Also, don't forget to share and subscribe. I'm Chris. This is Movies and Munchies. Thanks for couching with me.